everyone? Good day, and welcome to another episode of the Afrikan Diaspora Dialogue Podcast. I am your host, T. Jamal, joined as always by a wonderful plethora of intellectual panelists. I have joining us from Glasgow, Scotland, by way of Zimbabwe, my brother Tawona. How are you doing today?
I'm good, thanks, Jamal.
Calling in from Qatar by way of Los Angeles, my sister Michelee. How are you?
I'm feeling wonderful today. Feeling excellent.
Great. From Trinidad, calling from Trinidad, my sister Kaysia. How are you doing today?
Feeling good, feeling great. How about you?
It's the ATL coming out. And then from Guyana, calling in from Atlanta, my brother Mota. How are you doing this great day?
I'm excited, but I'm actually tired. I think the 9 hours of sleep overdid it.
Sometimes over. Exactly. I'm more refreshed when I get like 4 to 5 hours, honestly.
I'm telling you. I don't know what's going on.
Above that, I drag like I'm sick or something. So, as always, for those of you who are familiar with the show, the Afrikan Diaspora Dialogue is a conversation about things, topics, and issues that are important across the African diaspora. That is the dispersion of African-rooted people all over this globe, primarily created by the transatlantic horrors, but some have been created voluntarily. And we want to know what's going on with each other all over the place, because I believe the more isolated we are, the more vulnerable we are. And the more connectivity that we create for one another, the more bridges that we build, the greater it is that Pan-Africanism can be not just theoretical, but tangible, which is the work of Afrikan Unity Initiative, but also it can be sustainable, because we've seen so many moments in history where the African diaspora can come together, but then they kind of fizz out. And we want to make sure that those things don't happen. So this is the safe place to have the difficult conversations. And today is one of those difficult conversations that really is going to penetrate the diaspora. Today's episode is entitled Don't Like one of my favorite Keith songs. And I think that a lot of the times we focus on the things that we don't like so much that we never really understand or realize what it is that we want, or we never communicate effectively what it is that we want. So what does don't like mean? There are these, I'll call them myths or preconceptions or perceptions of Black people from different regions of the diaspora, and we have these notions about one another, and they come up in family conversations, they come up in our media and our exposure to one another, and most of the times they are negative. I'm going to go around to the panel and ask, are you familiar with negative perceptions of other Black people from other regions? And if you want to, you can speak to, negative perceptions of Black people, like, for example, Kaysia within Trinidad and the distrust. But I really want to hear about, like, if that exists. But I want to hear about from growing up, and we'll start with you since I came there. Growing up in Trinidad, did you hear anything about African Americans? Or did you have any type of preconceived notions prior to, actually interacting with them? Or did you have preconceived notions about Africa or any other place in the Caribbean? Let us know.
For me, I have a unique perspective because I was born in Trinidad. I spent a lot of my life living in the States. I lived in New York. I also lived in Atlanta. And I also would very frequently come back to Trinidad. So I had this really unique sense of identity. And for me, I think whenever the various things I heard about African Americans would be like, make sure you don't be lazy like them, or it would always be like them. There would always be a statement and there would be a like them. And so it depended on what group of people I was around. If I was around someone who was far removed here in Trinidad, far removed from ever interacting with African Americans, then I would get those types of statements. Then if I was around people who, had a more global perspective, they would just be a little bit more inclusive in their commentary.
Right. Okay. Yeah. That lazy commentary, I remember just being around people from the Caribbean in like high school and middle school. I remember hearing it and it like penetrating, and I was like, okay, this is coming from, people that look like us, and they just calling us lazy. And it came from an idea that we were wasting the resources and all the opportunities that we, have access to here in the States. I'll head over to Mota and ask the same question. Were there any, negative perceptions from, people from where you grew up, or like the adults that were around you that had negative perceptions on African Americans or other people in the Caribbean, or even the continent of Africa?
Yeah, I can't speak too much on specifically at home in Guyana. I came over here pretty young, but we stayed in a largely Caribbean community. So there's that perspective, and it's very similar to what Kaysia said, which is it wasn't, you didn't want to be associated with, and it was funny at the same time. You couldn't talk white, you didn't pridefully want to associate Black either. So it was strange. There weren't too many specifics. Maybe there was a very serious lacking of self-esteem as far as beauty would go. There's been a revival of that recently, trying to raise the Black psyche. Laziness was absolutely probably number one, even more so than any violent references. Even the consideration of 90s rap and everything else, it was always just look at what they're doing. A phrase that I'll never forget is so like, you can say, well, they're back at it again. People would like slide in an insult and say, well, Black again, and I was like, oh, well, all right. So you've already summed me up completely, or that person completely, and they're just Black at it again. And it's always these subtle backhanded insults. I really wasn't exposed too much to a full blown perception of the Black man or the Black people. And if I ever referred to Africa, it was, even as a kid, I could tell it was all in ignorance. It was childish at best. I didn't really so much hear adults say anything beyond, they don't think it's developed. It's probably a bunch of disease. Oh yeah, AIDS this, AIDS that. The mosquitoes will kill you. This. I mean, at this point, they see it. They feel so classic. They probably went unnoticed.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No. I can understand that. It's like you hear things so often and you hear it so much that you kind of like tone it out. But it started to, and I feel like I did that a lot as a child, toning out just things. But it was more when I started to see it for myself and really grew into, you know, reading about Africa and wanting to know more
Right.
about different parts of the diaspora, that it started to, like, those things started to come back up into my mind. Like, I remember hearing all of these different, you know, types of statements. So we're going to go to Tawona. Tawona, did you have any, like, growing up in Zimbabwe, or even in your time since you've been in Scotland, have you had any negative perceptions or negative ideas that were going around about, you know, Black people in the Western Hemisphere, in the Caribbean, in America, in Europe? Did you have any, like, preconceived notions, and were they, like, ideas that were going around just in the culture?
Off mute.
You're muted.
Thank you.
Okay.
No, it's I would say for Americans, you know, African Americans, there's a paradox, because there's on one side this admiration because they're living, you know, we are kind of, we take in the culture through, you know, sports and music, and there's a kind of triumphant streak through that of, you know, making it and doing well. But funny enough, within that too, there is the, I guess, the portrayal of some kind of lack of discipline, and not being cultured. These are notions that are very heavily associated. Not being cultured, you know, sort of behaving like the way white folks behave. You know, that's a criticism coming from some kind of, you know, the way, oh, look at how they're speaking to their folks, whatever, you know, that kind of thing. But there's this admiration as well, because they are, you know, African Americans set the pace for a lot of young African people. This is my experience, yeah. And in terms of elsewhere, you know, the information is so much limited, because I guess for me, I'm quite interested in who tells the stories. As a storyteller myself, who tells the stories? So for us, the people who told the stories were interested in, you know, America, and then in the Caribbean, it was narrowed down to mostly information would be available around, you know, Jamaica, because of the influence of reggae and that culture.
Right.
But the other countries, you would struggle to find, unless people were interested or had some, you know, motivation or knew someone personally. It would just be this kind of sort of a blur, but Jamaica, because of the reggae culture and everything like that. So yeah, that's definitely how people, I would say, yeah, my experience of growing up looking at that.
Yeah, no, that's good, because those things are mirrored in a lot of my experiences as well. So, same question to you, Sister Michelee. What was your experience?
Yeah, I actually didn't have, I don't remember having a lot of exposure to a lot of other Black people, you know, outside of America. But as I got older, I guess, and, you know, went off to college on the other side of the country, I would hear things like, well, I had to really dig deep and think about what other people said, because I still didn't have a lot of exposure myself. But I would hear, and
Right.
especially based on the media, about like poverty and, you know, being dependent on foreign aid, and so, you know, like that kind of created. Well, this is what is going through my mind. It kind of created like that like greedy, or desperate type, you know, attitude or activities associated with, like, you know, scamming. I've heard of people saying that, you know, like a lot of people are scammers and hustlers, and you know what I mean? Like they'll always just try to get you for your money, or you know, rip you off or something. But yeah, I mean, I can't
Right.
think of too many other things besides that, because like I said, it wasn't something I personally experienced or witnessed firsthand. But yeah, those are things I heard, and what everyone else was saying basically is what I heard more about what other people thought about us, I guess, with
And what
those
were those things?
interactions, what people thought about us being lazy and just not ambitious enough, like with us having all the access to all the resources and education and all, different things like that, and we're not taking the initiative to like better our position in society. And yeah, I mean, pretty much that's the main things that stick out for me.
Yeah, and that same thing is true for me, because as especially like I had an affinity for Africa very early, like growing up, and being told by Americans that I'm not African was one thing. And then meeting, African immigrants here and then being told by them that I'm not African was a whole nother thing. And so it was like, okay, I'm just getting shut down on all sides. And so, that can really create a some anger in a person. But instead, I just kept reading, right? I was just like, I'm gonna prove these people wrong, right? And, I remember growing up, like a lot of you said, my access to information about the Caribbean was just Jamaica. We had, Bob Marley, Cool Runnings, and media like that. And then in hip hop, all they really referenced in Bob Marley was, marijuana. And it was fortunately I had an aunt and an uncle. I had an uncle who was from St. Thomas who married my auntie, and they were both Rasta. And so I saw and I heard the music for myself, and I saw the other side of what that was, and not just limited to, smoking weed all day. But in Africa, all we saw was just animals and disease and poverty. And so what I saw, the effect that it had on my peers, was that they didn't want to associate with Africa. And those negative connotations had a huge impact on how people viewed and how people talk about where they want to go and what their experiences are. And also, I remember when the earthquake happened in Haiti. This is what, 2010, right? And I was over my auntie's house for Thanksgiving or Christmas or something like that. And then at like the table, a lot of the elders in my family were saying how, it was going to happen to them because of, voodoo. I remember them saying the same thing about Hurricane Katrina because of the voodoo association with New Orleans. And so they just felt like these places were cursed because they didn't know much about, the actualities of African spiritual systems, and that, Vodun and all these things aren't evil, right? And just that idea still permeating through my family. And like I said before, sometimes when we get educated, we just assume that other people have been educated with us. And you kind of get hit with the fact that there's still a lot of, misinformation and just ignorance that floats around, even within the, the elders of your family. And we were talking about, I want to mention, how do these stories get told and who is in control of these stories? That's always been a question to me, because like this is coming from my elders. And if I was a more impressionable person, I would have these beliefs, right? And it just goes to show how important it is for us to know and be in control of our own narrative, which is something that we will continuously state on this platform, like being in control of our own narrative, what that means. And it means questioning the origin of these myths when they do pop up. So did you guys ever, when you were exposed to these myths, did you ever question the origin of the negativity that you were hearing about other Black people? And we'll start with Mata. Did it ever occur to you, like, where's all this information coming from, or why is it coming?
I didn't question it in the truly broader sense, in the discovery sense. I question it as a, like, how do you feel that way? Why, like, why are you saying this so strongly? You know, but my scope, because I mean, as a kid, was like, did your parents tell you? Did your grandparents tell you? It was nowhere near the level of, be it institutional or the media or some stronger influence, something deeper, something that may have been in place, 100+ years, some kind of bad, not to say bad juju, but something passed down that you don't even remember what the origin was. It was very local to my friends, or like, why do you think that way? Maybe I'd ask my dad, well, why do you think that way? But I didn't. I don't know if it hit home hard enough for me to take it so deep to identity, to question, my association with it, to need to know why this was the way it was. I do remember a few times it did trouble me. Well, whenever people speak strongly on something with little evidence, especially when they use it to hurt someone else, it's always a question of, well, how'd that happen? Like, even if you say, yeah, I heard his mama do this, I'm like, well, who told you that? So it was admittedly a basic questioning, but yeah, definitely most times I would come across it, I'd say, I don't think any of you know an African, so I don't know how you determine that African booty scratcher makes any sense. And I'm sure there are a bunch of people that scratch their butts on a regular basis, so I don't even know why that would be a bad thing for them to do it. So, like, it's just like, what does that even mean? Like, what does it mean? What are you telling that person when you say that to somebody? What is the insult? And you call somebody a tar baby, you just mad because they're darker than you. It's like, well, and I grew up probably one of the darkest people I know. What I call light skin, other people call regular black. I'm like, no.
Right. Yeah.
No.
I have a very different perception of light skin from other
Very different. Very different. People still have a comfortable amount of melanin before I call them fair or red. They got a very comfortable amount.
So Kaysia, did you ever question the origin of this information when you were younger, or even as you grew? Like the origins and how did people come up with these narratives?
I would say I didn't question it necessarily. For me, I just thought, okay, well, that's your concept, your opinion on it. Just like he was saying, I didn't really have the forethought to think, well, how this impacts me in intellectual or how does this affect my identity. I didn't think like that. I think as a child, I was just thinking like, well, why? Like every child asks, well, okay, why? Why do you think like that?
Right.
Because I had the identity that I had with these people and who are saying these things, and then you also have the identity of being in school with African American students and seeing that could be further from the truth. Now there are, some people who fall into that category, but not because they not because of their race, but because that's just who they are. And so I would like to add that I mentioned earlier, in the Caribbean, let me speak specifically to Trinidad. In Trinidad, we in some way honor Africa. So the African American part of it would be those things that I mentioned earlier. But as far as Africa, we definitely we honor Africa. We have Heritage Day. We have a lot of different things that, well, a Heritage Month, actually, festival that we Tobago, our sister island, and we have a lot of things that really kind of hit back to being African, and there's a pride around being African. So that aspect of it, I never heard of the negative commentary. But in recent years, I have heard commentary of, well, yes, we're Afro-Caribbean. However, we can't go back to Africa because we wouldn't be accepted.
And this is a recent thing.
As far as the African American, this is recent. Yeah, this is recent.
That's interesting. That's a twist. Yeah, because what I've been seeing more recently is more people in the diaspora actually talking about repatriation. So it's just interesting, and this is why we have the Afrikan Diaspora Dialogue, because you have so many people from so many different places, and you see things happening on social media and trending where you just kind of overgeneralize and think that everybody's on the same page. And now with you saying that there's a recent trend in, and at least in Trinidad, of people not believing that they would be accepted back. That's a wrinkle. So we'll touch on that a little bit later. I do want to.
There's different groups of people.
Of course, yeah, definitely.
There's
like
types,
I mean,
the one. I don't represent all of the Caribbean, but there's different types. Even within communities, you may have people who have traveled and who have been exposed and have that desire to be, to go to Africa, explore that aspect of themselves. But then you have the people who are comfortable where they are.
Yeah, that makes sense, and I get that. Just like we saying African Americans, right? But as an African American who is from Atlanta, people who are from the Midwest, people who are from the Northeast, people who are from the West Coast, like all Black, are very different in, just regional thought process and development and culture, as well as within those regions, just you have individuals who think differently. So we're not speaking as if every region is just monolithic in thinking, right? We are speaking to these issues from our individual experiences and also from our experiences with a broad number of people to create some type of generalized statement. But people hopefully will be, smart enough to understand that each one of us, we represent wherever we come from, but we can't represent the entirety, which is why we do this on this platform, so that in the comment sections we can engage with people so that they can give their input, so that we can hear other people's access and different perceptions as they grew up. So we encourage you guys to like, share, comment, subscribe to this channel. Make sure that you engage with the video, share it to your social medias, because we want these types of conversations to be shared and had, as well as to be modeled in how to actually converse with one another and not talk at each other. So, Michelee, the same thing when you were growing up, or like you said, you didn't really have that much access growing up, but when you did face the information that you were hearing about us as African Americans from other people, as well as your views and your perception and what you were being shown of Africa, did you ever question why or seek out the origin of how this information was, created?
All right. Well, yeah, for sure. Especially thinking about like what we saw on, in the media about Africa, and other Black people around the world. We always see poverty. We always see all these negative things. And so just becoming more aware, the system that I'm growing up in. I'm like, of course they wouldn't show anything positive about him. So that one thing was already kind of like checked, like, okay, well, they're not trying to say anything positive about Africa. So I'm not going to listen to anything that they say. I would rather go and find out myself, or talk, meet people and find out myself. And so, like I said, coming from California to Georgia, and meeting, interacting with more people from different cultures, um, and other black people from America, who had these experiences and have these opinions about people. I realized that a lot of people form these ideas just based on a couple interactions, with people from the Caribbean, or from Africa. And like I had a lot of friends that were from like the East Coast, for example, when I first moved to, when I first went to college. And they have larger Caribbean and African communities wherever they're from, like in different places in New York, and wherever else along the East Coast. And they would have just the idea about, like how certain people are. And I think I started investigating, just thinking to myself, like, the fact that American culture, like, period, it just, the relationship or the attitude towards immigrants, no matter where they're from, like, it's just negative a lot of times. And so I think that definitely contributes to people's opinions about, other folks. And then just also learning about um who are these people who are coming to America, first generation, or just fresh off the boat, fresh off the plane, wherever you want to say, coming straight to America. And they are like, they come with a different mindset, like when people talk about us being lazy, not taking advantage of all the opportunities and resources that we have. It's like they go there with the the purpose of bettering themselves, and like, advancing their own situation, their family's situation. So it's a different type of motivation. And I think it's also, for us being there, like, we've lived through the frustration of we've been trying to do all this stuff, and a lot of us have been doing it, but we've, like, had a tough time. So it's not that we don't want to do it. It's not that we're not trying to do, make a better life for ourselves, there in America. But I think from other people's perspective, it's just like, it's just what they're seeing. They come there and they form opinions, just like, whoever, we all form opinions just based off of what we're observing. But I think it's just a disconnection on, like, well, this is what I see, but they're not actually considering the whole picture. Or we're not talking to each other. You can make up a story on your own, but if you're not talking to the people, then you having a conversation with yourself, just trying to come up with the story yourself, rather than finding out, well, why is it that they are this way, or that they're not, so far along, so far ahead. But yeah, I think mostly what I came to find out, was just the understanding the attitude of Americans, period, towards immigrants. And yeah, I think that contributed a lot.
And that makes sense. Like the general thought of how America thinks about immigrants, but currently, right? Because America hasn't always thought that way about immigrants. And then how does America think about certain immigrants from different places? Because I don't hear that narrative from, European immigrants and, their numbers. And if those immigrants are coming from places where, more melanated people are coming from, what is their perception? And even as African Americans, us being indoctrinated somewhat passively, a lot of the times unconsciously, taking on the thoughts of even our oppressors and having that same type of narrative, right? Allowing that to push us to think a certain way. And it's funny how those things happen. But before I continue, I want to go with Tawona. When you were talking about growing up in Zimbabwe and then having kind of like a dual type of perception where in one way you are, you know, very much influenced by like popular culture from African and music and all types of other things, but also simultaneously able to frown upon a lot of the other activities that you are being presented with. So did you ever question like the origins of these things or like how they continue to spread, or was it pretty clear?
It's funny because you know, exposure is a wonderful thing, and exposure, I guess, it comes through the more reading of your own you do, or traveling, which is a very important thing. But before the travel and a bit more, you know, insight comes through, you know, looking for information yourself. You don't really question it. I should let you guys know as well that, you know, when we were kids, you know, we played Cowboys and Indians, and no one wanted to be an Indian, as you can imagine. We played all those games, and we kind of, at the same time, we also used very negative language about ourselves, about our ancestors' names that our ancestors had been called. In Zimbabwe, for example, the kind of the street language for calling each other black people, we call each other my boy, my boy. Like, this comes from boy, you know, when our ancestors were called boy, when grown men were called boy, you know, to sort of in that colonial era. So yeah, we were kind of quite innocent. I think also for me, that's why I'm quite passionate about education, because the educational system had no intervention in that narrative. You know, we went to school, we were kind of most of the time forced to speak in English, and you know, most people had two names. You had your home name, like I would be Tawona at home, but at school I would have to be called an English name. So the registry of births, most people, yeah, most people have two names, one English name and one local name. And your local name is kind of brings a bit of shame, or it's not cool, whatever. You know, when you're in school, you have to be called by your. So all these things, it takes a long time before you start actually having even any realization that these stories are playing through your mind. And within that as well, another context to add is, for us who grew up in Harare, you know, if your parents had kind of a bit of social mobility, you grew up in Harare, wherever you grew up, and then the stories that we had around even people who live in the countryside, like our grandparents, we grew up looking down on those people, and those were not our eyes necessarily. It's just we did not associate those people as having, you know, as being knowledgeable people or as being progressive people in any way. But it takes time to peel those layers off, you know, before you can even start thinking about it at all. But yeah, for most of my youth, I never questioned it. But traveling exposed me to so much more, and I got involved in so many conversations. I mean, one narrative which came to me a lot, which kind of shocked me a little bit, was the idea of, you know, Africans being responsible for selling other Africans, and sometimes that would crop up, you know, people who were born outside Africa, you know, Caribbean or you know, American diasporans would sometimes, those sentiments exist of, you know, you guys sold us. So yeah.
Yeah, I am so happy that you brought that up, because I was definitely going to get there. Yeah, because that was one of the things that still keeps a lot of people in the diaspora not really wanting to connect with the continent, because they feel like they have been betrayed. And there is this narrative that, you know, Africans sold y'all, the ones that stayed, they sold y'all. And there is elements of truth to that narrative, right? So just like in a clip that we are going to get to a little bit later, where it's kind of like said very loosely, but I remember like really, really digging deep and studying hard in the narrative, trying to figure out if it was 100% false or were there elements of truth in it and whatnot. And what we saw was that slavery has existed in so many different places throughout the history of, the world, but it was never the chattel enslavement that was done in the Western Hemisphere. So, it's kind of like a false narrative, even in that sense, because if you go to war with somebody and you win the war, those people just kind of get swallowed up by your ethnicity. And that's kind of how it was. You were a little lower ranking in that society, but it wasn't ever a thing of you were dehumanized or you weren't looked upon as a person or you couldn't have a family or you couldn't move freely. It wasn't anything like that. It was pretty much just like house servitude. And then even in those cases, a lot of the times it was for a set amount of time, right? So it kind of mirrored what indentured servitude was here in the U.S. So when you had people who were like war prisoners and you had these other people coming in and they were, trading slaves, a lot of these places, they sold people into not knowing what the extremes of enslavement was going to be in the Western Hemisphere. There are cases of people finding out and actually, stopping it and fighting against it. So those narratives, some kind of way, never get told. And then the ones about us constantly being sold into slavery by other Africans is highly produced. And so it's just like Tawona said, like a lot of you guys said, it's about exposure. It's about getting this information out to ourselves and just making sure that we are open to it when it comes across, comes into our presence. But the thing is, we also have to question, like, why would that narrative be something that they wanted to spread? Like, they didn't tell us nothing about ourselves, but they made sure to drop that bomb in there. And I just have always been the type of person that, why? If I didn't know nothing about Africa, but I know this one thing that, they had, accountability and responsibility into selling those of us who aren't there anymore. And then they also give us this narrative that those of us who were enslaved were the most uneducated and the ones that were being kind of thrown away. When you really look at it, Europeans didn't know how to survive in the Western Hemisphere. They needed people who knew how to work the land. They needed the experts in agriculture. They needed the experts in the constellations. They needed the experts. So they kidnapped a lot of the higher ranking, most highly educated people. And, those narratives aren't shared either. So it's just very interesting how all of these things play out and how they end up being really resulting in this don't like narrative, this don't like mentality across the African diaspora that continues to keep us isolated from one another. And what that does is it keeps us in a place where Haiti's problems are Haiti's problems. Trinidad's problems are Trinidad's problems. African Americans' problems are African Americans' problems. Guyanese problems are Guyanese problems. And I don't care about what's happening over there. And the more we don't care, and the more we turn our sights off from one another, the more all of us are getting exploited simultaneously because we aren't speaking up for one another. And in previous episodes, we've talked about South Africans joining forces with African Americans to help end apartheid, or at least bring to light the realities of what was happening. We've spoken about, the African independence movement being inspired by, African Americans. We've spoken about how Haiti, fighting for their independence, looked at it as a victory, not just for themselves, but for all Black people in the Western Hemisphere. So we've seen these moments of diasporic thought and unity, but consistently, more so sustainably, we see this narrative of us being isolated from one another. And I wanted to go into a clip that kind of has caused some ripples in the diaspora, where we have Akon, who is a Senegalese born, American raised person. So he has a very interesting perspective on how he views certain things. So we're going to listen to this clip and I'll get you guys' perspective on what Akon is saying here. We don't have the audio. Can you guys hear the audio?
No.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. So
No.
hold on. Try it again. See if you have to disconnect it and share it again, and then
Yeah,
make sure that you click that that share the audio button. Hold on. We lost Kaysia again. Be patient with us, guys. The technology is always giving us a hard time. It tries to play
Europeans,
us. So hold on.
Jews and whites were involved, but
okay, there we go.
Africans were involved in it
Right.
as well. They were
Absolutely.
selling off their enemies.
Rewind
the
that.
enemy
Rewind
tribes
that.
and making their
We're not
money
just
and
gonna
so
let
forth.
Vlad slide.
How was slavery
Rewind.
really looked at?
Vlad tries to you're not just gonna slide that in there, Vlad. We heard you.
all right. Let me know when y'all ready.
Go ahead. Go.
Yeah,
That's crazy, man.
How do Senegalese really feel about slavery and what happened? Because there were a lot of very foul people involved in the slave trade. There was, of course, Europeans, Jews and whites were involved, but Africans were involved in it as well. They were selling off their enemies, the enemy tribes, and making their money and so forth. Like, how was slavery really looked at out there?
Well, in Senegal, we've kind of overcome the thought of slavery. We don't even think about it. The only time we think about it, honestly, is when we're doing tours at Goda Island. Outside of that, people have lived and moved and way beyond the slavery concept and idea and mind state.
Right, because in Senegal, you actually know your history. You can trace your family back 100 generations, whatever else. You still have your names, your real names. You're not named Johnson,
and Jackson,
and Washington, Luther, and all the other slave owners that were the presidents who had slaves during that time, Jefferson, and so forth. Yeah, but you guys actually have your history, and that was the whole thing of walking around Senegal. People just felt. This was the first time I felt Black people just felt comfortable, and with no type of disease. I mean,
I think it's also the art of just letting the past go and moving towards the future. And I think in the U.S., they have this stigma of just not letting go of the past and blaming the past on every mishap or, disappointment. And I think as long as you hold on to that past, it's just a lot of weight that you carry with you everywhere you go. And it's hard to move forward and move fast when you got to, weight on your back. You just got to let it go.
There's also been no reparations. And there's been,
Yeah, but unfortunately, man, like, it's not like America is going to take the initiative to do it. I mean, otherwise they would have did it already. Indians got reparations. The Jewish got reparations for Holocaust, and it wasn't even done in America.
That's true.
You know what I'm saying?
Italians got reparations.
Italians got reparations.
Japanese.
Japanese got reparations.
Yeah.
It's just, you know, it's to the point now where African Americans have to really understand their worth and realize that America was never or intended to ever, you know, consult or even make up for any of that. They're not sorry. They don't care.
Yeah,
it's obvious. So, do you want to stay here and continue to be treated this way, or just go back home where you're now no longer the minority? You actually are the majority, and you control your destiny and your future and your land.
Yeah, no. Honestly, every Black person who has an issue with how people are treated in America, they really should go to Africa.
They need to. They just need to go.
99% of them have not.
I've never been there.
Yeah.
And they're super afraid to go.
Like, a few of my friends, you know, the Michael Jai Whites have gone back, and you know, the John Sallys have gone back. The people with money, you know, and means. But the average Black person in America has no idea how dope Africa really is.
I'm telling you, they have no idea.
Yeah.
But I mean, you know, America did a great job brainwashing here. True. Because I'm telling you, the moment you mention Africa, they start shaking.
Yeah,
they don't even know
why.
Why.
Think there's just tigers jumping into your hotel room.
And... All right.
Okay. So
that's that.
I just want you guys. So I'll start with just this, and then once I say this little tidbit, I'll go around to you guys and get your thoughts on what Akon said. Now, as for me, the vitriol that Akon got from saying this, I think was insane, right? Because I don't think people were listening to actually understand what he was saying and where he was coming from. The issues that I have with what he said, though, was he said that. So he said that there are African Americans, there's this stigma of us holding too closely onto the past. I slightly disagree with that, only because I don't believe we know enough about our past.
Right.
I don't think that we're taught anything about who we are or what we've done. And Akon says something about knowing our worth. I think a lot of knowing our worth can come from understanding what our people here have accomplished even after enslavement, like understanding the victories that we had in the period of Reconstruction, in the period of when we had all of these Black Wall Street type communities, the Seneca villages, the Rosewoods, the Harlems, those types of things. We learn about them sometimes as like this flat surface, as if Black history happened in like one decade, right? As if Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells and Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Du Bois and Garvey and Washington all sit in the same time period, and there hasn't been this long, you know, struggle of resistance. And so that right there is the part that I disagree with Akon on the fact that we are too much clinging to the past and always blaming it. I think a lot of the times we sweep over it and try to forget it too much, so much so that we fall into the same traps. So that's the part, and I don't think it can just be swept over as a move past it. Especially from the context of, oh, the Senegalese have kind of moved past enslavement. Well, right. You know, those of us who are still on the continent didn't experience that aspect of it. They experienced the emptiness and the void of the people who were taken. They didn't experience the brutalities of the actual transatlantic experience. So I can understand how people are offended by a move past it, right? Especially when you're saying the only time we think about it is when we go to the slave dungeon on Gorée Island and do tours.
Right.
So I get it, but if you actually continue on, like, you know, people will take that little clip and play 1 minute when it was first of all, it's a whole hour interview, and that whole clip that we just watched was 3 minutes and some seconds. So if you get to the end of it, you get to understand his main point is the fact that we need to depend more on ourselves more on our worth, but I understand, and I disagree with the fact that we cling too much onto the past, because I think we learn from our past so that we don't. That's what Sankofa is, learning from your past so that you don't commit the same mistakes in your future, and you create a clearer path by actually, admonishing what your ancestors have already accomplished and then trying to do that again. But I'll let you guys speak. Tawona, what were your thoughts coming from Zimbabwe of what Akon said?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I sense some sense of frustration in him somewhat, wanting this thing to move on. But my own view on it is that, it's interesting because we can only build from where we are by looking back to where we've been. So there is some, I guess I can see what you're saying, Jamal, about history is relevant because that's how we learn our lessons for trying to make things better for not only the present but going into the future. That's why history is such a key subject. I think the main things that happen in our lives, the systems that we kind of live in, economically or politically, definitely are learning from history. So there's something to say about that. But I think the big problem for me is that we are in a post-traumatic period right now, and we have not had the rehabilitation. And I guess part of what we're doing now, this conversation, is part of that attempt at rehabilitation. We're in the post-traumatic period. We have not had the rehabilitation because the tools have not been available, because the systems that have brought us up, like for me, my educational system, I have lots of, criticisms of it because, this idea of segregating, learning. I know we have this, I'm going to bring up another, controversial thing, but, we end up with things like Black History Month because it shows you that the curriculum is currently, ethnocentric. Otherwise, there would be no need for a Black History Month. That history would just be part of, if you are studying history of the world, you would study that as part of your history. But we know that the turkey doesn't vote for Christmas, as they say. So they're not going to. The Europeans, they take great pride in talking about these that they call the world wars because they were on what is perceived as a good side of history. So the Holocaust is blasted to us constantly, but anything to do with the history of the encounter of Europeans and the African continent is seen as it's controversial. It's difficult to talk about. We'll go through this so many times, all the time, So this is what's preventing anything going forward, So the fear of reparations, what that might mean economically for this capitalist consumer system, all these things get in the way. So there's always going to be a frustration. People have not been rehabilitated. Where do those feelings go? Energy cannot be destroyed. It only kind of transforms. Where does the grieving has not happened? So we've not even gone through the grieving process properly. If you talk to people who kind of know these things about psychology, the stages of grieving, we've not even been through them properly at all. It's just random, it's just this random act of trying to patch ourselves up. So we are nowhere near addressing these things to even begin. So we need to seriously sit down and start looking at what that means, the whole narrative as well of, we know the atrocities and, because slavery, as you were saying, Jamal, I think the difference with the transatlantic slave trade and what used to happen with people being servants or whatever in previous times, it was the brutality and the efficiency, of creating this triangle that things are going around in a circle. But, there's been no rehabilitation. So, people cannot move on because those wounds are always open. Those wounds are always open, and they're always reminders in your professional life, in your personal life, that these hierarchies are still there. So it's a very difficult topic to just approach in that sense. I guess part of my wish is that more of what happened on the African continent needs to be known as well by our brothers and sisters in the diaspora, because what happened on the continent itself was excruciating. If you look at, Zimbabwe as an example, the work of Cecil Rhodes in that whole region of Southern Africa, and Cecil Rhodes till this day, people argue about him whether he's a good guy or a bad guy, but it's ludicrous to my mind, that argument. And the only legacy of someone like Cecil Rhodes is this Rhodes Scholarship, where a lot of esteemed people currently, in Scotland we had the Commonwealth Games in 2014, and I struggled to get the point across to people that David Livingstone is not a hero to African people. He's a hero to to people of his birthplace and everything, but his work in Africa, benevolent as you may claim he was working for the empire. So the massacres, the internal displacement of people living in reserves. My own father, don't go far. My own father had to work on a plantation to put himself through school, a tea plantation. My own father. So the distribution of the land grab, the kind of disrespect of human rights, the disregard of people, the massacres that happened, the tribalism, the kind of functionalizing of tribalism, we're still struggling with those problems now. So there's a lot of damage that has happened, but the tools have not been there, and the structures that we look to have not been able or have been unwilling to allow that to begin the grieving, never mind healing or rehabilitation. So I think we need to gently tread on this one and start, like these conversations we're having, I think are very important in us just trying to explore with each other, ask each other questions, share each other stories. And I grew up in Zimbabwe, and until I went to high school, I had no idea the things that had happened in Zimbabwe when it was still called Rhodesia, because it's not spoken about. I didn't realize the extent of subjugation that was going on, because when I go to school, it's, we inherited the British system through colonial mechanism. So we go to school, we learn about all the great people of Britain and Europe, and world history. Like, world history is just what happened in Europe and America. We don't learn anything about our own. So when you're a young person, especially when you start university, you start discovering all these things that are going on in your own country, and you go. So there's a period of anger. A lot of young people kind of don't recover from that, to go, oh my, this happened here in this country, So I think this is an important conversation that we need to tread very carefully and very, look for a bit of wisdom around it.
You said something that one of my favorite words, especially when it comes to these types of conversations. You said nuance. A lot of people don't understand having a nuanced conversations, meaning that there are levels to the conversation, meaning that you can agree and disagree with the statement that somebody said. I can take parts of what Akon just said and agree and understand his intention and understand his point. And then I can also critique it and disagree with certain elements of it, right? I can have a nuanced understanding of where he was coming from, but also not disregard the entire person, right? Not just throw Akon away because I disagreed with a piece of what he said.
Right.
And I believe, this is what we need to get to. This is why we have this platform. This is why we are trying to, in these conversations, model how to have a conversation, because there are 5 people on this panel right now. And all of us come from different perspectives, are going to view things in different ways. And it's very important for us to be able to listen to one another and understand each other's points of view. So I want to shoot it to Michelee and get your standpoint from what Akon was saying, and then even responding to Tawona.
Right. So, okay. Part of Tawona's response is there is a great point that I was going to bring up about just our not understanding of the struggles, you know what I mean, like of Black people in America. I'll just say, speaking from our perspective, speaking from, I know the mindset a lot of times. And I shared this interview with, with my network, with some of my friends and family, asking what were their thoughts on it. And it was a lot of negativity, like, well, forget Akon, he doesn't know, like these Africans are always telling, everybody is always telling Black people to forget about slavery and forget our, what we went through and continue to go through. And I think that just completely just missed the point of everything he was saying. And I've also heard him speak, several other times on the same subject. And he is always like promoting just this idea of Africans in the diaspora, especially African Americans, just knowing the environment that we're in and knowing the people that we're dealing with and understanding how we've sort of like bought into this idea that we can have, you know what I mean? Like we can flourish there. And I think when we think about like just the institution of slavery and stuff, like we were brought over and dehumanized. Like we were not meant to be a part of that equation, like other than building it, right? Like, yes, they used us as a tool to build their economy, to build their country. Well, that country, I won't even say theirs because it wasn't their land, but but
Right.
but like we were used, right? It wasn't like we were brought over, because a lot of times we like to, I've always heard Black people talk about, and bringing up the Constitution as, well, it said, telling them like, well, you guys said that everyone is created equal. And it's like, well, they wasn't talking about us, right? Like,
right.
During that time when it was written, they were not talking about us. But okay, so that's one point. That's one part of the argument that I could use. That I think is useful is knowing their language, knowing how to use their own words against them, which will take me to the point of thinking about how African Americans, how we involve ourselves in politics. Like right now, we're all seeing this conversation on, and everybody's picking apart the candidates and stuff. The candidates never actually, matter to me. You know what I mean? Like, because I'm thinking these are going to be the puppets anyway. We have to be the ones to push our agenda. We have after a couple generations ago, when it, like, just say for instance, during the civil rights movement, how they strategized, they organized to push these politicians to get, you know what I mean? They pushed themselves, they sacrificed, and they, made all of these moves and did it strategically to get things, done for our people. We're not doing that now. Now it's like we bought into this idea that they have to like us, they have to accept us, because they owe us this, that's how it's going to happen, not seeing the work that we have to do behind it. And so we have this dependency almost, and I would like to even say like a victim mentality. And something you said about about us not knowing enough of our history, that's the part of the work that we have to do is educating our children ourselves. You know what I mean? We have all this, have access to all this information. We have access, to go about the world as we please, I travel the world and I'm not rich. I didn't have a lot of money. You know what I mean? We can find ways to do things if that's our goal. You know what I mean? I know every single person won't be able to travel, but I'm saying we can learn though, and we can teach each other. And I think even when we complain about the education system, we complain about, all of these different under the same institution that was not meant to include us. Are we going to sit and complain about it, or are we going to explore new opportunities? If our ancestors built that land, that economy, why can't we take that inspiration and think, well, we can do it again? We have all this genius. Right. We have, you know what I mean? Like we have the strength and to be able to do it again. And I think we're also speaking of what Tawona was saying about colonization on the continent. We can, with the education of knowing what they went through there and what we go through here, having that shared, you know what I mean? Like just that connection of like, oh, they doing y'all dirty too. Then that can bring us together. Like, okay, we can build something together then. Let's depend on each other instead of you know, because you know the enemy loves to divide and conquer. Why are we continuously doing this to each other? We do it, you know what I mean? Like people do it, like he was talking about tribalism. We do it there. We do it in America, you know, between classes, between, you know, like all different types of groups that we're not working together. And I don't know. I feel like that people who took that interview took what Akon said as something negative. I think they were looking to be, you know, looking to be offended, because it was great advice. And I can understand, you know, like how, you know, council culture over cancel culture, we don't want to X him out for what he said. Maybe he could, maybe people wanted it to be delivered in another way. That's another thing to talk about. But the message was not trash. Like what he said is actually something we need to be exploring instead of complaining about the situation that we're in. We have to do the work.
Even his delivery, though, his delivery, in my opinion, wasn't horrible. It's just that when people hear a certain thing, like I said, it's about nuance, and people don't understand that. People don't have nuanced conversations between themselves, which is why so many people have no idea how to communicate with one another. They have a very difficult time even just relating to people in their own circle. And we see it on a daily basis.
Yeah, I forgot to add, it was just one other point I was thinking about, is like when I brought up the politics and thinking about what Akon was saying about, you know, we don't have to be just in that position. I think even when we think about using politics, we have to know the rules. We can't sit and think that things are gonna change just because it's old to us. Like, yes, we were in a messed up position. Yes, they did us wrong. Yes, they are continuing to do us wrong. But we have to know, if you plan to stay there, if you're not a Black person in a diaspora who wants to go back to Africa or wants to go to a place where you're not the minority and, you know, and not being done you know, unfairly, then you have to know the system and know how to work it to get what you want and need out of it. We cannot sit here and play the victim the whole time. And I know that's going to be a trigger. Somebody's going to say, oh, well, Michelee is calling us a victim, you know, and this and that. But the fact of the matter is, if you don't want it, like, you know how they feel about us. They show us, they tell us all day, every day. We will be fools to sit here and wait on them to hand it to us. No, like just what other people who have gotten reparations and stuff, like, yeah, it's not fair that other people have gotten reparations before us. And, you know, and it hasn't even been a conversation really, you know, until really recent times. We still have to think about, like, well, what if it doesn't happen? Are we going to wait until it does happen? Or are we going to do something about it? You know, that's basically my point on that. Because a lot of times when we talking about politics, they're like, well, we should just you know, well, forget that system or whatever. And it's just like this idea thrown out about, well, we need our own government. But what are we doing to get our own government? How are we uniting with the system that we have in place that we could use to our advantage? We're not even using that. So it's like, are we just going to be dreamers? Are we just going to just talk out of the side of our necks without actually doing the work? That's my point.
Yeah, and I agree. So Kaysia got stormed out, but she did message me with some of her thoughts, and I'll share them after Mota gives us his perspective.
Well, I recently saw the video for the first and second time, and I myself fell into the I guess an erroneous interpretation between my first and second ones. I took what he said a whole lot lighter the first time. The second time around, I guess I missed a few key words, and I see where people can take offense. I think I see it as the classic positions that Tawona and Michelee have, where you have to recognize the pain that's there and the lack of healing. And it's hard for people have a right to not move on until that healing's done, especially when they can't even place that hurt. They're not even sure, aware that they're even feeling that hurt. They hear the comments. We've all heard the comments as kids, as adults. We've all heard the relations, and it might have bothered us, but those questions haven't been answered. And ever since doing therapy for myself, I recognize that it's been a huge psychological impact on the Black community, what has been done and what is still going on. And the way people are addressing it now, more on the Michelee side of the statement, is that it's a call for action, but it's you have to tread lightly in that when you take the stance of action, because you need the healing, because whatever ground you gain, it won't feel as good. And it's so strange how much feelings matter. But let's go back to the times where it was a very popular thing to key his car and to burn his house and clothes. And it's like, they knew it's wrong, but it felt good.
Yeah.
and it now we're even. That guy did what he did, and so, and I always used to think back in the day that was one of the most ridiculous things I'd ever heard of. Like, address it lawfully and you'll be fine. But I bring that up to say I guarantee reparations would be a start. But if one day every African American just got $5,000 in their bank account, they'd be happy. But if everything went on the same way and no address, no official apology, no recognition, no, dropping Black History Month, adding whole chapters and education on it. I didn't even realize. I don't know why I thought this, but I thought the majority, at least, of the African continent would get African history. That hurt to hear you say that. That I don't know, but it makes sense. Colonialism is colonialism. What makes America different than that continent? But
Yeah.
it's like that's the source. Like some of the books should have made it over, but I mean, we're big on oral history, so if you're not writing it down, then you read what they preach.
Yeah.
But as far as I recognize why some people, I believe the people wanting the healing and wanting a sense of closure, or just to even start the process. Again, after therapy, I realized you can't smooth over this. You have to address it. You have to speak on it. Like one of the major ways to start healing is to address your attacker, and that you can skip it if it proves to be too traumatic. But the BLM movement right now, the constant, I mean, when we look through the years at all the, not even progress, just events in racial tension, they're still happening. Reparations isn't gonna, it's still happening, like a full-blown acknowledgement, and they can elect as many Black leaders, they can celebrate as many Black lives. Beyonce, Jay-Z, and Kanye, they can make it to all the nice positions, but the underlying reality of the majority of Black people feeling as though, the system's out to get them, those will only be small victories and examples of what you could achieve. But if the conversation at home is, y'all know white people, as long as that's still a very real thing, it's the progress won't be made. And I believe the people that are offended with Akon, even if they can't say it in an intellectual way, perhaps, but that he hurt them, and they're using words to express it. But long story short, he hurt their feelings, and he where he's from, and the groups where perhaps the woke individuals around him need to understand, just because they're woke, everybody else isn't. And some people, rightfully so, are looking for more healing than that not to say that progress, but that something, a tangible kind of progress. There's an internal something that needs to be addressed. And of course, we can all see the other side.
Yeah.
I think you made a very a very important point about people not being able to articulate how it made them feel. Mm-hmm. The reason that people jump to, you know, especially in the social media age where you can just, there is no, like when you had to write a letter when you were angry with someone, you had to make sure that that letter made sense. You had to, you know, you needed a pen, you needed paper, you needed to make sure that you wrote it the correct way. You had time to actually yourself. And, you know, it actually took money to go to the mailbox and go to the post office and get a stamp and close the envelope. So before you sealed that envelope and you couldn't open it back up, you made sure that whatever it is that you were trying to say, at least on that paper, was said in the correct way. But with social media and being able to immediately respond in a YouTube comment section, on Twitter, on Instagram, and then also being limited in your characters, you also can you also can end up you know, saying the things that you don't really mean, or not really being able to articulate your full thoughts. And you know, those things have to be considered as well when we are assessing even the people who are saying cancel Akon. Maybe they're not really saying cancel Akon. They just don't know how to express that their feelings are hurt. You know what I mean? Right. And it's just very important for, like I keep saying, nuance. We need to have a nuanced understanding of the people who are upset with Akon. We need to have a nuanced understanding of what Akon is saying and what he's trying to say, and understanding how to have conversation. Like Michelee had a point, Tawona had a point, Mota had a point, Kaysia has points that I will share. But the thing is, having actual time and taking the time to listen to one another and digest what the others are saying, and making sure that we're not just taking offense to be offended, right? And so I'll just share a little bit about what Kaysia said. She wrote it to me in a message. She's in Trinidad. It's storming there, and so her connection just ran out, right? So we understand how those things happen. That is the price we pay for actually bringing you a real to life African diaspora dialogue with people who are actually across the world and in the diaspora. So she said that some things she wanted to share. We say things like, let's move off the past and move on. We need to consider things that are currently existing that directly affect this idea and moving on, because our past is aligned very much with our present, i.e. systematic disadvantages such as redlining, over-policing, the inability to have access to resources to build certain infrastructures in our neighborhood. So it would be different, and I've said this before, it would be different if the struggles of Black people kind of mirrored the Holocaust. The Holocaust, once it was over, right? It ended. It was a horrific time period, but when it ended, it was done. Enslavement ended, and then worse things started to happen. We didn't start getting lynched until after enslavement. we didn't start getting like serious, because while we were their quote unquote property, they didn't want to kill us, right? They wanted to actually keep us healthy, to make sure that we were taken care of. We were cattle. You know what I mean? A farmer isn't going to just kill the cows. You know, you're going to train them or whatever, but this is how we were looked upon at the time. When we were free, we were a threat to them, especially when we were free and actually being economically successful, when we were disproving every bit of their propaganda about us being inferior. When we and believe and take this into consideration. After enslavement, we were already 300 to 400 years behind them, and then we still caught up to them economically, like almost immediately. Just think about that. So when we talk about reparations, we're not just talking about reparations for the time of enslavement. We're talking about from the time of the destruction of what we had to suffer, the trauma of the lynching, the trauma of Jim Crow, the trauma of black codes, the trauma of now. There's no way that America could ever realistically pay us reparations.
They can't afford it.
Because there's no amount. We would, you know what I mean? I'm talking about America. I'm talking about Europe. I'm talking about France. They all owe us reparations, right? They all owe the African diaspora. Anybody who has been in the transatlantic experience is owed reparations from whoever was responsible. And all parties were responsible because we know that we came on the same ships, right? Yeah. We were all on the same ships. We just got dropped off at different destinations. And we've all had our post-enslavement trials and tribulations to deal with, and whatever we're speaking of, right? So whether it be the U.S., whether it be Central America, South America, the Caribbean, we've all had our experiences as Black people who've suffered through that transatlantic experience. So the idea of moving on is, again, like all of us have said, is a little bit premature because we haven't even addressed it ourselves. We spend a lot of our time trying to convince people that our issues are real. There's no time to move on because we're trying to validate the fact that our experience is real. We haven't even got to a point ourselves where we can even start to think about the solutions, which is why everything that we do here is about being results oriented and solution oriented, because we need to move the conversation a little bit. I think we're ready. We're at the stage now that we're ready to move past validating our experience. We have enough proof and enough history that our experience, if you don't believe it now, then we just move on. We don't have time to speak to you, right? Mm-hmm. We have to start talking about what do we need to do collectively to set the agenda to bring on the results that we want. So we need to think about these as algebra problems. An algebra problem is 2x minus y equals 6. But you know the answer. So we need to stop focusing on, basic math problems where we're still trying to find the result. In algebra, you know the answer. You're trying to find how you got to the answer. This is where we are as Black people. We need to know, okay, the answer is the progression and the sustainability of Black people, of the Black community, no matter where it exists, right? So that's the answer. Now we need to figure out, okay, what's the X variable and what's the Y variable? How do we get there? And formulate those steps, and not thinking about, okay, let me prove to you that X is a variable. No more time for proving the validity of our struggle.
Right.
And no more time to be harping only on the struggle. Go ahead, Mish.
Right. Yeah, part of something that I said about with us, even when it comes to voting and participating in the system, however we do, it's not that we are not participating. Black people have been look at how the Democrats, or both political parties, the most popular political parties, how they use us, or anybody else in that country uses us. We buy into it. We are, we are active. We put our votes and all of our time and energy and stuff into this system, but not using it for us. We are being pimped basically. And it's if we don't learn though, if we don't start to do the work, it's just basically going to come down to sacrificing, buckling down on learning the information, that means making the connections with people. Those of us who are traveling back and forth or having, conversations with people throughout the diaspora and learning our experiences, we're going to have to do that work to educate our children to that's just how white people are. But knowing, like basically teaching them, this is your position in society. This is where we need to go. So I'm teaching you our history, not to just keep it relevant, just to harp on it, but to understand how we need to move forward. Because like when somebody, I think Mata, you did mention, or somebody mentioned about having all of these Black politicians and stuff, and nothing is going to change with, we're still working with the same system. Just having a Black face is not going to change our situation. And I think at a certain point in history, just maybe a generation or two ago, a couple generations ago, people started thinking that, well, once we are accepted in this system, then that means that, our problems are ending, and it's just not. We just have to be wise about it. And that's my point about like with this whole situation with that Akon was saying. I don't think at all he was saying, or I would never suggest like forget our history, say that it didn't exist, or just completely ignore it, but knowing where we have to go from there. Like he was saying, you can't, when you're weighed down like that, you can be waiting on an apology forever. They might not ever like how many times, how many generations have we been having the same conversation when it comes to politics, when it comes to police brutality, whatever situation, we are constantly in the same conversation, and we know how they feel about us. We will be waiting forever. If like, just say if you're an abuser, if you're in therapy or whatever, for a traumatic situation, your abuser died. You're not going to get that apology from them. You know what I mean? Like if your abuser is going to continue to do that to you whenever you meet them face to face, and they're like, well, I'll shoot you in your face. You are not going to have that opportunity to meet them face to face to get that apology. So we have to understand, like, what are the things that we need to do to move forward? And I think about like, using that motivation, using that knowledge, that pain to push us forward, instead of, because the alternative is sitting and waiting for something to change, and it's not going to change on its own.
And that's why I believe in listening to an entire, so you have to listen to a person's words, listen to a person's intention, and then, listen to gain an understanding of the points that they're trying to get across, right? So to tie this back into the whole don't like scenario, right? It's all about us not having enough communication with one another. And when it does happen, not understanding how to effectively communicate. We can't, there's nothing wrong with disagreeing with someone. Nothing at all. And there's also nothing wrong with disagreeing with elements of what somebody is saying and understanding how that can work. But to gain an understanding of, okay, now I understand why they feel that way. Now let me tell them why I feel the way that I feel, and communicate it in an articulate way. The thing that we are saying, though, is I believe a lot of our people don't have the ability to articulate exactly how they feel, because we are, we're scratching the surface as to really understanding what has really happened. And so when you haven't even had that conversation, it's very difficult. It's very easy to just go off of just your raw emotion and lash out. And I believe this is what we're doing. And we've been throwing around this council culture over cancel culture. I first heard it from Charlemagne. He was actually quoting somebody else on his podcast. And I was like, that is exactly what we need to do. We need counseling, like Mata just alluded to, even in his own experience of going through therapy and working out some of the issues that he wasn't even privy to. How much collectively as a Black people, we definitely need therapy. And it just became popular to talk about mental health in the Black community, and even take it serious enough to actually consider it a real part of our health. So a lot of this vitriol, a lot of this toxicity comes into the fact that we haven't settled within ourselves how we are feeling about ourselves, how we're feeling about other things. Because you'll see and hear people double talk all the time. You'll hear people say, I don't want anything to do with Africa. You'll hear people like down talk other Black people, even from their own region of the diaspora. And then at the same time be offended by somebody, you know, saying something negative about Black people. And it's like, but you're doing the same activities. And it's because we're battling internally with what those things are and how we do it. So we talk about bridging the gap on this platform, and I created this acronym for GAP, which is a global African perspective. And I believe that this is where we have to come to, where we understand where each other are coming from as a diaspora, as a Black people, as African descendants, however you want to, you know, name yourself or call yourself. But I believe that this is an important element into, you know, ridding ourselves of this don't like mentality, of just building that communication. And the bridge is something that can be physically done, right? I believe that, yes, Black people should go back to Africa and at least visit, at least experience it. But I also strongly believe that the advancements that have happened in the United States would not have happened without us. And we're not going to abandon it and just give it all the way freely to these people. We're going to stake claim in what my ancestors built. We're going to stake claim, you know, the contributions that we have in Europe. I want all of those African artifacts that are up in museums in the United States and in Europe, and all of the jewelry that was stolen, to be given back and not included in the reparations that we're talking about. Because that's just straight up stolen actual physical material. And then, you know, they have the gall to say that they're protecting it for us to preserve it. We didn't ask for that. We didn't need you to come and babysit our treasures. And so we are fighting on so many sides. The side that we can't be fighting on is amongst ourselves. All right, we cannot continue this internal fighting, and it's just ridiculous. We have had a very fruitful part 1 of Don't Like, and we will continue this conversation next week with another group of panelists who are from across the diaspora. I want you guys to let people know where they can find you. Mota, what do you have going on that the people can get in touch with you and just follow along with what you're doing?
What I'm doing, I'm well, right now I've established myself on StockTwits, and I gotta get a handle. I have to actually consolidate all my efforts in all the places I'm in. But next time we meet, I will have something that they can follow along. Getting pretty good at this thing. Might even be able to support myself on it.
That's good. Yeah, that's dope, man. So, you know, this is just a segment to let people know what's going on with you. And when you have the actual social media platforms, or email that you want to share, or websites, or whatever it is, you know, you'll be on here to share it, and the people will be right here to support it. Michelee, Mishmash, what's happening? How can people follow you?
Yeah, you can follow me on my business page on Mishmash World on Instagram, and then on other social media, Mishy the Maker. But I also have a website at www.mishmashworld.com, and I am uploading a lot of new products. I've been in work during this whole COVID season, so I'm uploading a lot of new stuff now. So people can find me there, see what I'm doing.
Yeah. And that's dope. And as always, Afrikan Unity Initiative is an organization dedicated to community and economic development. We believe in making Pan-Africanism tangible, not only theoretical, something that you can actually get involved in, activities that you can be, doing in your communities, and, ways that you can get involved is by liking, commenting, sharing, and subscribing to this YouTube channel and be a part of the conversations that we are molding and building, and we're curating an audience that is able to articulate how we feel as a people and where we need to go, solution oriented, results minded. Also, we have a website, www.afrikanunity.us, and you can find it everywhere on social media at Afrikan Unity. All of that is scrolling across the bottom of the screen. We love all of you. I love all of the panelists that came in and dropped out today. We had some issues and people had things they had to get to, but it's all love. We will see